Okay, welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're plunging into a topic that might just completely shift how you think about a very familiar art genre.
hmm
When you picture still life painting, maybe a bowl of fruit, vase of flowers, perhaps a table groaning under the weight of cheeses and wine, what comes to mind?
Well, for most people, that instantly conjures images from the Dutch Golden Age, right?
Exactly.
Those incredibly detailed atmospheric paintings from the 17th century, they really set the global standard, the historical etalon for what a still life is supposed to be.
Absolutely. We see those and think, still life. But today we're turning our gaze south to Italian still life painting, or natura morta.
Hmm.
And thanks to some deep insights from a leading expert's lecture you've shared, we're about to uncover a history that is much richer and starts much earlier than that standard Dutch picture suggests.
Yeah, our mission in this deep dive really is to explore the unique character and origins of Italian still life. We want to figure out why it's perhaps less universally famous than the Dutch examples, and how it's profoundly shaped by what we'll call the Italian cultural code, a deep, persistent way of seeing the world.
And the big surprise here, the core takeaway we're chasing, is that Italian still life isn't just a later development or, some kind of footnote to Northern art.
Not at all.
Its roots run incredibly deep, stretching back further than almost anyone expects. So let's start where the conventional story often begins for Italian still life, maybe even European still life. Caravaggio's famous basket of fruit.
Right. The painting The Ambrosiana in Milan, probably around 1599, give or take, it's often cited as the foundational piece. And the source notes, there's still some debate about the precise date. Was it just before or immediately after he landed his first major church commission?
Interesting.
Yeah, that uncertainty is kind of interesting because it really marks a transition for him, moving from these smaller, more personal works to grander public art.
It feels significant that this iconic, seemingly isolated still life kind of pops up at such a pivotal moment for Caravaggio. But how does it stack up against what most of us think of when we hear still life?
Well, like you said, the immediate contrast is with the Dutch tradition. When you think of a Dutch still life, say by a master like Willem Claesz,
Yeah.
you think of incredible detail. The source mentions things like the fly on a pastry,
Yeah.
the texture of rich textiles, the way light catches on glass or silver, just amazing detail. There's this overwhelming sense of atmosphere, of capturing the tangible reality of objects, usually in a domestic setting.
Yes, they feel almost lived in, like you could step into that moment. Even though, they were carefully composed, they convey a feeling of everyday life.
Exactly.
And that detailed atmospheric quality really became the benchmark globally in the 17th century.
It really did. That 17th century Dutch Golden Age was incredibly prolific and influential, and their style became the template many people just default to.
So why is the Italian approach so different then? If the Dutch were creating these richly atmospheric windows into domestic life, what were the Italians doing and why isn't it as widely known?
Okay, this is where that concept of the Italian cultural code becomes really crucial. Our expert source really emphasizes this.
Okay.
Fundamentally, in Italy, particularly after the Renaissance, the absolute highest calling for a painter remained the historical picture.
The big stuff.
Right, history painting. That means religious scenes, biblical narratives, classical history, mythology subjects with significant human drama and cultural weight.
Okay, so history and narrative dominated. Unlike Northern Europe, especially after the Reformation, where the demand for church art declined,
Right.
and artists naturally pivoted and specialized in things like landscapes, everyday genre scenes, and, still life.
Precisely. While artists in the North were increasingly specializing in depicting the visible world for its own sake, exploring its texture and atmosphere, Italian artists remained focused on the human form, on narrative, and on subjects that carried profound meaning within their cultural context.
So this cultural code, it's like a deep, ingrained visual sensibility.
Yeah, exactly. A persistent way the Italians perceived the world and what was important to depict. It influences everything, even when they do include objects. And it doesn't easily transfer between cultures, even if styles might be borrowed sometimes.
That's fascinating. So it's less about just showing the world as it is and more about showing it in a way that aligns with this deeper cultural priority.
Yeah.
Can you give us an example of how this code influences how they handle something like space or objects within a painting, even outside of still life?
Absolutely. Let's look at depictions of the Annunciation. It's a common subject, but the difference in approach is striking.
Okay.
Think of Fra Angelico in Florence, in the monastery of San Marco. His Annunciation frescoes are all about space, about meticulous architectural perspective, about how light shapes that constructed environment. There's almost a sparsity of descriptive detail. The space itself is the main character. It's dominant, carefully built, very intellectual.
Right, it feels incredibly thoughtful and structured, almost mathematical.
Now, look at Carlo Crivelli. He's Venetian, so a different regional flavor. He often includes more details in his Annunciations. The source mentions things like cucumbers, flower pots, even a peacock.
Ah, yeah, lots of detail there.
But even with these added elements, they are still contained within a very clear, structured, often elaborate architectural setting. The building, the perspective, the framing elements remain central to the composition.
So even when objects appear, they are sort of subservient to the overall architectural or spatial structure?
Exactly. Or consider Leonardo da Vinci's early Annunciation. While perhaps less overtly architectural than Fra Angelico, he uses elements like trees and the landscape structurally. His focus is on light and shadow, the monumentality of the figures. The composition is still profoundly constructed and intellectual in how it organizes mass and space.
It really sounds like the Italian core isn't about that charming atmosphere of everyday life we associate with the North,
Not primarily, no.
but about using all the elements, figures, architecture, even potentially objects to build, define, and activate space in a structured, intellectual way.
That's a fundamental difference. Now, let's contrast that with the Northern European perspective we touched on.
Okay.
If we look at earlier examples there, like the Master of Flamel's Merode altarpiece, we see interiors absolutely packed with incredibly detailed symbolic objects. A candle, a lily, a towel, and a niche.
Right. Every little thing seems to mean something.
Exactly. And there's a warmth, a sense of lived reality, even if the perspective isn't always, perfectly mathematically correct.
Yeah.
The focus is on the tangible world and the meaning embedded in its details.
And Jan van Eyck's Arnolfini portrait is the epitome of that, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely.
An incredibly intimate domestic scene filled with symbolic details like the dog, the discarded shoes, that famous mirror reflecting the room. It's intensely atmospheric, capturing the poetry of ordinary domestic life.
Yes, Van Eyck's work was even called Ars Nova by contemporaries, a new art, precisely because it felt so distinct from the Italian Renaissance's focus on classical forms and antiquity. It was a different way of seeing and valuing the world.
Okay, so Italy is building these intellectual spaces in monumental forms, while the North is capturing the rich reality of interiors and the objects within them. Did this northern emphasis on objects and everyday scenes start creeping into Italy?
It absolutely did, and it's a crucial step towards Italian still life, emerging as a distinct genre. By the 16th century, artists like Peter Artson and Joachim Becler in the North were creating these large-scale genre scenes.
Right, the market stalls, the kitchens.
Exactly, where the still life elements, the depiction of food and goods became incredibly dominant.
Oh, like where the main subject, sometimes even a biblical scene like Christ at Martha and Mary, is almost hidden in the background.
Precisely.
And your eye is just drawn to the piles of produce or meat.
That's the one. Or think of Bruegel's landscape at the Fall of Icarus, where the mythological event is just this tiny detail in the corner, overshadowed by the everyday activity of a farmer plowing.
Yeah.
In these northern works, the focus shifted to the flow of ordinary life and the vibrant interaction with the material world.
And these genre scenes were popular in Italy. People wanted them.
They were, particularly in northern Italy, in Lombardy. Works by Ertzen and Buckler were known and sought after there.
So Lombardy was like a point of connection for this northern influence, a gateway.
Precisely. And you see artists there like Vincenzo Campi in Cremona directly influenced by this. He painted market scenes where the primary focus really is the display of the goods, fish, poultry, vegetables, rendered with incredible detail.
So the people selling or buying almost become secondary.
Almost.
Yeah.
Secondary to the showcase of the still life elements.
And does that lead directly to independent still life paintings in Lombardy? Does it spin off?
It does. You start seeing still life motifs emerging from these larger scenes. The source points to details in altarpieces, like a vase of fruit by Lombard artists such as Moretto de Brescia, that seem to stand out and suggest the potential for these subjects to exist on their own, like they're ready to be their own painting.
So Lombardy is a key regional hub for early Italian still life, taking this northern genre approach and starting to make something independent out of it.
Yes, it was a crucial area, and this is where figures like Ambrogio Figino and Fede Galizia appear, painting some of the earliest known standalone Italian still lifes, like Ficino's really simple, elegant peaches on a dish.
And they were active right around the time Caravaggio was emerging, like contemporary?
Yes, they were contemporaries working in Milan or nearby, which opens up that interesting question the source raises.
Right.
Did Caravaggio see these early Lombard still lifes before he left for Rome? Or did his own early work perhaps influence them?
What does the expert think?
The expert suggests he likely encountered existing still life work there, meaning it was already a nascent genre in Lombardy when he was active as a young man.
Okay, so we have northern influence sparking things in Lombardy, but you teased something even deeper, earlier roots that predate even the Renaissance or the Middle Ages.
Ah, yes, this is where we connect back to that persistent Italian cultural code, and the story gets truly long, really fascinating.
Okay.
Italian still life has incredibly deep roots, stretching all the way back to ancient Rome.
Ancient Rome, you mean like the wall paintings in Pompeii and places like that?
Exactly. Pompeii, Herculaneum, Villa Boscoriale, Stabiae. There was a strong tradition in ancient Roman art of depicting food, objects, and natural bounty, often as offerings or gifts, xenia, they were sometimes called.
Offerings or gifts?
Yeah, and this idea of the still life as a presentation or tribute carried through Italian art for centuries. You see it later in things like artistic gifts sent to patrons, or even still life paintings donated to churches.
Donating a still life to a church feels really unexpected. I wouldn't have guessed that.
It does to us now, maybe?
Yeah.
But within that historical context, it resonated with this ancient tradition of presenting things of value, offerings.
Okay.
And the visual connection to ancient Roman wall paintings is striking. Look at examples from those sites that show motifs that look remarkably like later still lifes. Open cupboards or niches displaying objects like fish, poultry, fruit, or decorative garlands.
And you're saying these ancient motifs show up later, not necessarily because artists were like digging them up and copying them immediately in the 16th century.
Exactly. Many of these ancient sites weren't extensively excavated until much later. The expert argues this isn't necessarily about later artists seeing the ancient paintings and copying them directly,
Right.
but about a continuity of that cultural code, a particular persistent Italian way of seeing and arranging objects, often on shelves, in niches, or on simple stone surfaces.
So it's like a visual habit almost.
Kind of, yeah.
Yeah.
Caravaggio's basket on its undefined ledge, or later 17th century depictions of fish or eggs in niches by artists like Maggi, they echo these ancient compositions.
Wow. Okay, so that intellectual, structured approach we saw in the Annunciations and this ancient tradition of presenting objects, how do those two threads weave together in the Italian tradition of depicting space and objects?
Well, we can trace the intellectual approach to objects and space even further back in central Italy. Think of Giotto in the 14th century.
Okay, Giotto.
In his frescoes, you see depictions of niches holding liturgical objects. He's not just putting things on his shelves. He's rendering the niche itself with an early sense of perspective, showing space as something real and correctly built. The objects inhabit a constructed space.
I see. So the space is as important as the object.
At least once. And that leads to artists like Paolo Uccello, who was famously obsessed with perspective in flooring.
Maybe the perspective guy.
Absolutely. The source mentions Uccello's drawing of a vase. But what's remarkable is what he chooses to depict. He draws the structure, the geometric schema of the vase, in perspective.
Not the vase itself, but its blueprint.
Kind of. He's not focused on the surface texture, the material, or the play of light. He's using the object as a way to explore and build space mathematically.
So the object itself becomes a tool for intellectual understanding and spatial construction.
Precisely. It highlights that fundamental Italian focus on the intellectual geometric framework of reality, which is pretty distinct from a purely empirical interest in surface appearance or capturing atmosphere, like you might see more often in the North.
That fascination with space and illusion, using objects within it, makes me think of the intarsia in the Duke of Urbino's studiolo, the inlaid wood.
That's a perfect illustration. The Intarsia in Urbino creates these incredible illusionistic depictions of open cupboards, shelves overflowing with objects, musical instruments, books, armor, even a squirrel, a basket.
It's like a permanent trompe-l'oeil still life installation. You feel like you could reach in and grab something.
It's a brilliant play on illusion and the interaction of object and space. And look at the motifs again, the open cupboards, the way objects are arranged on shelves. It directly echoes those ancient Roman wall paintings we talked about.
So it shows this continuous Italian fascination with illusion, with structuring space, and with the carefully arranged object as part of that whole intellectual game.
Exactly right.
So even before still life was really a distinct genre, Renaissance masters were kind of setting the stage,
Well,
laying groundwork.
definitely. Not by painting still lifes in the way we understand them today, but by fundamentally changing the attitude towards depicting the natural world and the objects within it.
How so?
Leonardo da Vinci, for instance, was an intense observer.
Yeah.
The source mentions he carried sketchbooks and drew everything, flowers, insects, plants like beans and cherries, just pages and pages of studies.
That famous curiosity.
Right. This incredible curiosity about the visible world, combined with his scientific interest in light and reflection, think of the details in The Last Supper, the way light hits the glasses and pewter race. It created an intellectual space where still life could eventually flourish.
And Raphael. He's another you don't immediately connect with still life.
True, but Raphael revived that ancient Roman tradition of depicting garlands and frescoes, notably in the Villa Farnesina in Rome.
Ah, the decorative elements.
Yes, but what's really telling is that he actually employed a specialist, Giovanni da Udine, specifically for these still life motifs, the fruits and flowers.
Really? A dedicated still life guy.
Yeah, this shows that by the early 16th century, these elements had enough importance to warrant an artist dedicated just to them. It wasn't just an afterthought.
And so still life elements existed not just as small panel paintings, but as monumental decoration on walls, part of the bigger picture.
Yes, that was pretty unique to Italy at the time. Also, look at Raphael's St. Cecilia altarpiece. He places musical instruments on the ground in the foreground.
I remember those.
They're not just symbols. They're placed compositionally. They help guide the viewer's eye into the painting's space, anchoring the figures. Again, objects are used to structure and activate the space within that Italian framework.
Okay, so we have ancient traditions, this intellectual approach to space, Renaissance masters changing the attitude towards nature, and Northern influence sparking developments in Lombardy. What else is happening in the later 16th century leading up to Caravaggio's basket? Any other interesting threads?
Oh yeah, you see fascinating variations. There's Jacopo Legozzi, a Mannerist artist from Verona who worked in Florence. He's one.
Legozzi.
He sort of bridged art and science. He created incredibly precise yet really artistic illustrations of plants and animals for collection, detailed irises, a dying fig leaf. It's an empirical observation, definitely, but filtered through this very refined artistic sensibility. It's not just a scientific drawing.
So it's like art transforming scientific illustration, making it more elegant.
Exactly. Legozzi also created these remarkable venitas, or macabre works, sometimes painted on the reverse of portraits, featuring skulls, decaying flesh, insects, creepy stuff.
Right, the memento mori.
Yeah, it links still life motifs explicitly to themes of knowledge, the passing of time, mortality.
And then there's Archimboldo. Everyone knows Archimboldo. His composite heads made of fruits and vegetables.
Archimboldo is a unique phenomenon, really. His work is tied more to the courts of the northern Habsburg emperors, where he worked.
Up north.
And a taste for the playful, inventive, and sometimes, well, grotesque. While his works involve objects, they are kind of distinct from the main trajectory of Italian still life as it develops.
So more of a courtly novelty.
A bit, yeah. Though interesting, like Caravaggio's basket sometimes, they can combine elements from different seasons, suggesting a conceptual, almost puzzle-like approach rather than just observing what's in front of you at a given moment.
Right, not just painting the fruit bowl on the table.
Exactly.
Okay, so you have all these threads weaving together. Northern influence, ancient tradition, the intellectual approach, Renaissance interest in nature, and these Mannerist variations like Legozzi and Archimboldo. What about the very immediate period before Caravaggio's famous basket? Who else is around?
Well, we know artists like John Bruegel the Elder, often called Velvet Bruegel, were working in Italy around this time.
Ah, a northerner in Italy.
Yes, and his popular flower still lifes were certainly known and influential. Very detailed, very lush.
So there were already established still life painters working in Italy, albeit often from the north.
Yes, and as we said, Italian artists were starting to create their own, particularly in Lombardy, like Vigino and Galizia.
Yeah.
But if you compare Caravaggio's basket to a typical northern composition from that point, say by someone like Floris van Dyck, the difference is still really stark.
How so? What's the big difference?
Well, a typical northern still life composition from that era, like Van Dyck's, often uses a high viewpoint, looking down slightly,
Right.
and it's often prailing objects onto a table covered with a folded cloth. It's very descriptive, filling the entire frame with detail and texture. It's kind of an additive approach. More is more.
Okay, lots of stuff.
Caravaggio's basket is different. It's frontal, eye level, placed on an undefined ledge or plane. The background is abstract, nondescript. You don't really know the space it's in or even precisely where the light is coming from in a larger context.
Yeah.
It feels very isolated.
Ah, right. It combines that incredible, almost jarring realism. The wilting leaves, the wormhole in the apple, that sense of touchable texture.
And Trump-loyal qualities.
This really stark, abstract setting. It's just there.
That's precisely where its power and innovation lie. It takes that intense, almost hyper-realism, perhaps connecting back to that ancient tradition of presenting objects on a ledge, but places it in a completely new modern context of abstraction and focus. It synthesized existing tendencies, but presented something radically new and profoundly influential.
Wow. So what is often presented as the simple starting point for Italian still life Caravaggio's basket is actually this incredibly complex work, sitting atop layers and layers of history, regional variation, and this deep cultural DNA.
Exactly. We've taken this deep dive into what seemed like a straightforward genre and uncovered a history rooted way back in antiquity, shaped by regional influences, an enduring intellectual approach to depicting space, and evolving cultural perspectives on the natural world. It's much more complicated than it looks.
And it's so clear now that Italian still life isn't just a lesser-known version of the Dutch or a simple imitation. It's really a distinct and powerful expression of that Italian cultural code,
Definitely.
reflecting a unique worldview and historical context that goes back millennia.
Understanding a country's art truly means trying to understand its deeper cultural currents and how it perceives the world, even when depicting something as seemingly ordinary as a piece of fruit.
Which leaves us with a question for you, the listener, to ponder. How do our own cultural codes, shaped by our history,